Listen, going back though, we were talking about Dunedin University, you were talking and making the very sensible point that surely we should start concentrating on services rather than necessary bricks and mortar. And you were making the point about the agitation that's there. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon flew down, I think this time last week, to have a look at the aftermath of the flood. He was he had a few desultory protesters, mostly talking about Palestine rather than necessarily the hospital, it seemed, from the placards that was there. I've subsequently talked to the editor of the Otago Daily Times last week about coverage and things like that. Is there any solution that the government could offer Dunedin that is going to pacify them at all?
I think that if they focused on services, they would get there. Because if they said what we've noticed mostly Dunedin's lacking is these services, and this is what we're going to do to increase the services and give Dunedin people what they need. And it's not just Dunedin. You have found out that you need to go to Christchurch if you want to get orthopaedic and other things done. There's no skin specialists for even in Christchurch. Really, there's nobody much. So if the government actually looked and found out what we were short of, they would be better able to focus their financial attention on that, I think.
All right, okay. And you're probably right. I'm sure you're right as well. Listen, the other thing I just wanted to very briefly touch on is that the former finance minister, tonight there's going to be a One News Varian poll, and it's the legacy of the former finance minister is going to be pretty clear from the general gloominess that New Zealanders have about the future at the moment, and that life hasn't improved over the last 12 months. We're still living in it. He's living in his new role of 100 days as the Vice-Chancellor of Otago University. And curiously, at a time when you would think he'd be trying to batten down the hatches and make sure they regain their reputation, blah, blah, he's talking about expanding Otago University to Queenstown, probably the most expensive real estate in the country at the moment, and a very hard place to staff people because houses and real estate is so expensive. Is there a method to his madness, do you think?
No. He's also saying effectively the pain, the reduction of staff and other things, the downside and cutting your cloth and things problems are all in the past now. What he wants to do is increase the revenue.
Yes.
Really, Grant? You don't mean increasing the fees, and you're not serious that the government's going to give you a whole lot of money. What do you mean? What do you really mean? I mean, he's living in cuckoo land, I'd have thought.
He is talking about, I noticed when we were looking at the ratings or rankings of New Zealand universities last week, Hilary, one of the things I did notice was how few, in comparison to other universities, Otago University had foreign students. Now, it wasn't few, it was 1 in 6 in actual fact, so 16% of all students at Otago University are foreign, which is quite high, I would have thought, but it was by far the lowest in New Zealand. I guess that's one way he could think about expanding his revenue base, yeah?
I think we used to have a sort of a quota that we had a principle of not going above 15% or something foreign students.
Oh, Otago, you mean?
Yeah.
Right.
I could be imagining things there, but I think that there was a intentional thing. Like the government could decide, for example, since we've now, the proportion of people who weren't born in New Zealand is getting higher by the moment, we could decide nationally and government-wise how quickly we wanted to have immigration changing the ethnic and cultural landscape in New Zealand, instead of just having a free-for-all. And allowed to, or so people don't want us to talk about ethnic things or something, but we could actually say, for example, a majority of people come from India. Is that a good place for us to get? Is it quite a good cultural mix for New Zealanders if we want from somewhere? Is people who are from Palestine and from perhaps a Muslim background, are they a good fit for it? You're not allowed to, of course, say things like that. Do we prefer the Jews from Israel? Are they a better fit? Or do we just not care and we'll just let it go?
Oh, you couldn't go far wrong slightly increasing your Jewish population, I wouldn't have thought, in terms of your academic achievement. There you go. Listen...
Well, it depends whether they then want to get rid of the Muslims we already have, or whether they want to occupy New Zealand and not take it over by winning a war or anything, but just occupy.
That's right. Yeah, okay. No, you've convinced me. It's all right. We'll stop both Palestinian and Jews coming in. It'll be fine. Listen, mind you, where do we stop on that one?
I'm not suggesting we do. I'm just saying the conversation is worth having as to whether we want more people who are more like us already, or whether...
Does it matter as long as they've got money? That seems to be the view of most New Zealand universities. In fact, I think in that interview Grant Robertson was talking about attracting more international students, and it's something we talked about with Universities New Zealand last week in particular, designing courses in this country expressly for students from other lands. So
that would be tūtanga Maori courses, would it?
I was just going to say, yeah. Seems slightly counterintuitive.
That's not very transferable in an international sense.
No, I wouldn't have thought so. There you go.
But what we do know is that immigrants in general are more likely to not scream bullshit about some of the tikanga stuff because they don't feel it's their place. You know, it takes a generation or so probably for people to say, I'm a New Zealander and I don't like that. You can't say that if you're a recent immigrant, can you?
No.
So if we've got enough recent immigrants, then nobody will leap up and down and say compulsory treaty courses when we're not even sure what the treaty means. But it turns out Auckland University does know what it means, that the rest of us haven't agreed about. None of that conversation happens with recent immigrants.
No. Well, you're right. Ethnic diversity is okay. Cultural diversity doesn't work. You can't have one without the other, though, can you?
Well,
I mean, Indians are going to bring their Indian culture with them, and we've been flooded with Indians in the last, 5 years. Chinese people are going to bring their Chinese culture and their outlook with them. Who's the other big... Samoans are going to do it. I mean, it's almost impossible you wouldn't bring your culture.
There's some suggestion that Pacific Islanders, when they first arrive, bring their ideas about whether you can beat up your wives and things that they did for longer than New Zealanders tended to think was all right. But they, so some of that, a cultural violence can happen. I don't know whether the people we bring in from India, how they relate to the poor cultural Indian practices to do with men doing bad things to women. Don't know whether that's a cultural thing, or is
it's interesting you say that, because this is part of a much wider discussion. The Economist magazine, and I know you didn't talk about this, but can I raise this issue now? The Economist magazine, to which I subscribe, last week had an extraordinarily interesting front article, or lead article, on the fact that Western values, and you've just given an example of Western values there in a funny sort of way, and the rest of the world are becoming increasingly disassociative. So in other words, when we think about the internationalization of the world, and you would have thought that trade and media and music and a whole series of other things would make us a smaller world, What The Economist was noting is that the West is going down a particular ideological and cultural and social path, but the rest of the world isn't following, in fact is deliberately not doing so. Now we're talking about the Chinas, the Indias, the Russias, the East Europeans, the Africans, the Asians in general. So if we are going to be taking, if that's true, and we are going to be taking people from those different parts of the country who are not enamored of modern Western cultural practices and ideologies, then it is likely we are going to be importing people who will be resistant to them when they arrive, won't they?
Yeah. Although I don't know what effect it has that the people who want to come and live here don't want to live with what they had at home. Like when Maori leave New Zealand to go to Australia, they don't go there because Australians have a whole lot of Marae and Maori related things. They go there because they don't need that. They just want to be people who mind their own business and are plumbers and whatever. And from New Zealand's point of view, the people who come here are presumably people who don't want to be necessarily living the way they lived back there. But so you don't know whether you get a different selection of them. Somebody ought to know or ought to be asking, but...
Okay.
And if we think about what we're doing, you were talking earlier about having Maori people turn up in criminal statistics and not to. Once we start, we need to think more carefully about what are our core cultural values. Once you start going down the track of some people turn up more likely in statistics and therefore we can just get rid of them in statistics, we can, erase them, stop. Are we going to not arrest young men? Because young men cause a lot more problems than 78-year-old men, for example, and men cause a lot more problems than women. So are we going to try and get everybody to turn up in criminal statistics in the same proportion as they are in the population? Because you'd have to do a whole lot more than just not arresting Maori boys.